All right. And that's it. There are the two fuel sending units, the old one on the left and the brand new setup on the right. Today I'm changing the fuel pump and sending unit on this 95 GMC Suburban. Not because the old one has failed. No, that would be too normal. It's because, well, preventative maintenance. First step, remove the negative battery cable. Now I'm going to remove this metal protective fuel tank cover. Oh, that wasn't smart, but at least it's off. Ow. That's a lot more heavy duty than I thought. Oh, my back. Next, coming off the driver's side of this fuel tank, we have our fuel filler neck. I'm gonna have to detach. This is a typical worm style hose clamp. I'm gonna stick my 5/16 on there and loosen it up. And it is actually pretty easy to move there, so that's good. And right next to this fuel filler neck, there's another tube here that we have to take this hose clamp off of. This is gonna have to be removed as well. I have my jack here. I also have a big thick piece of plywood on there to try to spread out the load there as I hold up the bottom of the fuel tank, which is mostly empty. My fuel gauge is on E. I purposefully ran it down. And with that tank now supported, I can loosen and remove the two straps, and there's one of the bolts. I'm just gonna let down the jack a little bit, see what happens here. The jack is loose, but the fuel tank isn't budging. Fuel tank is now dropping onto the jack, which is what we want. I was having a bit of trouble, but I seem to have gotten it. And what I'm hoping is, there we go. Okay, so I went ahead and shoved some rags inside the fuel filler neck there, the hoses, both of them, the small one and the big one. And that's to not only block debris from falling inside, but also to keep any splashing to a minimum. This is a difficult task because I have the fuel filler neck, gonna wanna bind up a little bit. This tank isn't very heavy because there's no fuel in it. I mean, I'm sure it's heavy, but compared to being full of fuel. Tank is bound up again. Okay, here we go again. Gonna let it down more and more. Okay. I'm kind of in this weird situation where I have the tank hanging down on the passenger side, which is actually giving me quite a bit of room to work. I can fully see the top of the fuel sending unit, and I can reach everything. It looks like I'm gonna have to disconnect this hose and these two fuel lines. I'm also gonna have to disconnect a line here, as well as this electrical connector, which actually goes all the way up here. And from the other side of the tank here, you can see that connector right up here. All right, and that connector should be easy to remove here. Let's see. There we go. But it looks like we also have a ground wire I have to disconnect. And it looks like probably a 13mm will take this off. And there it is. Okay, well, in a situation like this where I have to use one arm to kind of prop myself up, yet I need to have two wrenches on these fuel lines in order to loosen it, we're gonna try the one hand method. And the one hand method goes something like this. You offset both wrenches, and you're just going to squeeze them just like that, and I loosened the nut there. Now with that nut loose, I can simply just turn it with the wrench using one hand. All right. Well, here's that 42-gallon fuel tank on the ground, out of the truck for the first time in its life. I was having some trouble getting this down. Even though all the straps and everything was loose and ready for it to fall, it just wasn't falling. I quickly realized this foam material here was actually kind of glued to the truck. So this is what was keeping it from coming down. Right here on the front of the tank as well. The other thing I'm noticing here is this putty-like stuff that's obviously dried, but it looks like the factory spread this all over the top of this fuel system to keep anything from leaking, I guess. So I might have to chip some of this stuff away in order to get this lock ring off of here. And here's what that new part looks like. You can see it looks pretty much identical to the factory one in the truck. Now this is what you call the fuel sending unit. It has the float on it, the electronics. This is obviously all the plumbing to send the fuel to the engine. And it did come with a baggie full of parts in order to mount the fuel pump and everything. And this right here is the fuel pump I bought. Here's that model number. And this will get mounted to that fuel sending unit. And here's what all that putty stuff looks like when it's scraped off. I grabbed the locking ring from the new unit here, and I noticed these little raised edges there. And those edges are the ones that are made for tapping to disengage this lock ring. All right. Okay, I'm gonna attempt to remove this whole thing without having any of this crud stuff fall in. I already cleaned some of it off. There we go. And here is the original factory fuel sending unit along with fuel pump. And here is our replacement fuel sending unit. And I'm going to be installing this brand new fuel pump along with this fuel strainer. And if we look towards the bottom of this assembly, you can see the float here and of course the fuel pump right there. So the job now is to mirror this setup. I'm going to install the fuel pump along with the fuel strainer right here on this assembly. Okay, I have the fuel pump actually installed. That was a little bit of a trick because of the fuel line is so stiff and the clearances are so tight. It was very hard to get everything lined up along with this little rubber gasket down here on the bottom. But everything is put together. I do have these two clamps I still have to tighten. And this type of clamp requires a special tool. And that tool is this right here. This one is by Lyle. I'll put a link down in the description below. You basically grab onto it with the jaws, making sure you're good and centered there and where you want the clamp to be, and then you just give it a squeeze, then you just let the tool go, and that is a tight clamp. And I'll do the same for this bottom clamp here. Both clamps are now tight. I now have to install this little strainer here, and I believe it's just a push fit. So that's what I'm going to try here. Let's see. Yep, that looks like it pushed right on there. And that's it. There are the two fuel sending units, the old one on the left and the brand new setup on the right. Slightly different, yet mostly the same. Okay, I think everything's right there. There's the gasket. Now that everything's been installed and I can see the new gasket is there in place, I'm going to go ahead and slide this lock ring down. This lock ring is exactly like the other one. It has these raised edges here that I'm going to use my punch to drive and lock into place. And this lock ring is now fully locked. You can see the stop tab here is driven all the way home. With everything now fully installed with the lock ring tight, it's time to start thinking about putting this thing back in the truck. When I took off this factory 5/8 hose here, I noticed that there was a few cracks going on the inside wall of the hose. So I just went down to the auto parts store and picked up some new 5/8 inner diameter hose. Now this isn't any old hose, this isn't heater hose, this is literally meant for fuel line. This is not a pressurized type of line, but it does say fuel line on here. Maybe I would have been able to get away with just using heater hose, but I didn't want to risk that. I didn't want the fuel vapors to somehow corrode this line and then, you know, it breaks up over time and starts falling back into the tank. Just to be safe, this is only about $3.50 a foot. I'm gonna go ahead and install this line right on here. There is a plastic protective cover on the bottom of this. Well, I have the fuel tank kind of sort of somewhat in place, and now of course the next step is to line everything up and reattach all of the hoses and electrical connections. And at this point, everything is put back together. The tank is strapped in. Power is back on. We're gonna prime the pump. Let's try it out. Not a lot of fuel in there. I have probably like 3 gallons of gas in this tank, so I think I'm gonna just give it a shot here. All right, I probably just put in a gallon, but let's give it a shot. All right, she's a-running. I gotta get some gas in this thing. Woo! That was kind of hard. I guess it was. I mean, it's not super hard, but it sucks. You know, it's just a difficult job. You're dealing with the fuel tank. You got to run the fuel tank really low, which I did. You're dealing with gasoline fumes. I absolutely can't stand that because I feel like I can smell it like days later. Yeah, preventative maintenance. That's why I did it. I didn't want the factory fuel pump, which at this point was about 28 years old, to fail on me on a long road trip. That wouldn't be good. So I figured at 28 years old, you did me well. Fuel pump, let's get a new one in there, and that's what I did. The hardest part of this job, of course, is dropping that fuel tank and reinstalling that fuel tank. But as long as you run the fuel tank really, really low, which is kind of difficult to do in itself because then you deal with potentially running out of gas and having to get your vehicle towed almost as if your fuel pump has failed. Never mind. As long as you run that fuel tank down to about empty, you're gonna have a lot easier of a time dropping that fuel tank and doing the job and getting it back in. You're gonna be able to tilt the fuel tank in certain situations so you can get at certain things on top. And if it's full of fuel, you're not gonna be able to do that very easily at all. Well, again, I did this in the name of preventative maintenance. Yes, there was a little bit of me that was hoping that maybe it would help this thing to run better. My old fuel pump was working just fine, I think. I don't know, actually. I've never tested the pressures on it. And that was something that was in the back of my mind was, am I gonna change this thing out and all of a sudden the truck's gonna wake up because maybe the old fuel pump was weak or something? But I just drove this thing all around town. I floored it a few times. I just really wanted to get it up to temperature, get everything running, working good, and there's no leaks, and everything felt exactly the same, normal, which is good. Don't forget, you can follow One Road on Instagram and Facebook. The handle is @OneRoadGarage on both. And there's also the website at oneroadgarage.com. Make sure you check the description below for all the parts I used. I'll list them all down there. And I think that'll do it. If you've watched this far and you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing. And also, if you've watched this far, hit that thumbs up. It really helps this video and the channel. Well, I'm Jimmy for One Road, and I will see you in the next one.